is we'll turn to our passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And we'll start in verse 12. And it says, everything is permissible for me. Here we go. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. This is Paul talking to the Corinthians. Now, if you don't know, the Corinthians had huge sexual issues going on in their church. Bad stuff. I mean, a guy sleeping with his father's wife and just incest issues and lots of sex. So it's not endemic to only our culture. But Paul is trying to correct some of these things. And he says, food is meant for the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. As God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two shall become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one in spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but sexual immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. You are bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Now, I'm sure youth pastors have read this passage before, and usually there's two things they land on. Should you join your body with a prostitute, because the two join together? And the other one is every other sin you commit outside the body, but the immoral, right? Since these are usually the kinds of messages we hear from this. Well, I want to emphasize some other issues. First of all, the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. What does that mean? What do you mean the body is for the Lord? If we are worshipful beings, how do we worship God? We worship God with our bodies, right? It's our attitude. We can worship God in our minds. I mean, you can drive to work and do it, but usually we close our eyes, we lift our hands, we project an attitude of reverence. One of the ways we worship God is we reflect it through our body. He also writes, but he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Notice the contrast that Paul is doing. He's saying the prostitute, you become one with the prostitute. If you join to the Lord, you become one spirit with the Lord. Which relationship are you choosing? Do you see the difference between these two things? And lastly, glorify God in your body. This is the command. See, this text of 1 Corinthians chapter 6 isn't all by itself. It sits in a background of much, much larger biblical knowledge, most of which you guys know but probably haven't thought about before. For example, Israel, throughout the scriptures, is portrayed as the unfaithful wife of Jehovah, right? You all read the book of Hosea? Remember Hosea? Hosea's got to be one of the roughest commissions as a prophet I've ever heard of. Because God says, go and take a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So Hosea is supposed to take a woman, marry her, knowing that this woman is going to be unfaithful to him. Okay? She's going to be unfaithful to him, and he's going to have children. And he goes on and calls this child, not my people, and this child no mercy. And what he's saying is, Israel has been unfaithful to me. How was Israel unfaithful to the Lord? What specifically were they doing? They were idolatry. They were worshiping other gods. We hear of that also in Jeremiah 3:1. The same idea comes across, where he says, if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? Would not that land be greatly polluted? In other words, this idea of women sleeping around and then coming back to her husband, this is something that the society of the day would recognize as ridiculous, as immoral. And then he says, would not you have played the whore with many lovers, and would you then return to me, declares the Lord? Well, return to me meaning come in the next day as though nothing happened, not returned in a faithful commitment. He's talking about, it's the eagle's lying eyes. You go out at night, you tomcat around, you come in the next morning, come here, hi honey, I'll give you a kiss and send you off to work. That's the concept. Again, what is the whoredom? What is the adultery? It is a worship of other gods. And in Jeremiah 3:8, then I saw that for all of the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, he writes, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but went and played the harlot also. So again, you see the same pattern. Over and over again, idolatry is considered a type of immorality, adultery. Now, the church isn't that. The church is something different, right? We are the virgin bride of Christ. We are unstained and unsoiled. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul writes, for I feel the divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. And then in Ephesians 5, Paul draws out this amazing parallel of husbands and wives and Christ in the church. Okay? So he says, the husband is to the wife like Christ is to the church, and the wife is to the husband like the church is to Christ. That's the parallel. Okay. So, if worshiping false gods is adultery, and we are married to Christ, then what is the parallel for worshiping the true God? It's the sexual union within the marriage bed. Sexuality is portrayed, proper sexuality is portrayed as faithful giving of oneself to one's spouse. Isn't that what the church does? So I'm not talking about sex as dirty, and I'm not talking about sex as fun. I'm talking about sex as holiness, as an act of worship. That's something different. Genesis, if the marriage relationship is parallel to the worship of God and the worshiping false God is equated with adultery, then the appropriate parallel of proper worship would be the sexual union. That's how the parallel. Now, what does that mean, though? If sex is not merely recreational, but holy and self-giving, realize part of worship, what worship is giving of yourself, right? You don't worship somebody expecting something, or worship God expecting something in return. It's not what worship is. If you're expecting something in your return, you're probably not worshiping appropriately. I worshiped you, God, now you'll fill my bank account today, right? That doesn't make sense. But one of the reasons why this parallel becomes important is because of how God orchestrated sex and what it accomplishes. Our sexual organs are the only organs in our body that require two beings to function properly. And when all things are working as they should be, guess what happens? You get a baby, right? And we see this even from before the fall. Genesis 2:24, the two shall become one flesh, is what God says. And then he quickly adds, so what God put together, let no man tear asunder, is what Jesus says when he quotes that verse. Now, notice 1 Corinthians 6. Paul made the same statement, right? In 1 Corinthians 6, right here, he says, verse 16, don't you know that anyone joined to a prostitute is one body with her? For Scripture says the two will become one flesh. But anyone joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. Now, this is really important because ever since the advent of the pill, our society has broken the idea of procreation from sexual activities. We've tried to separate those two things. And that's backwards. Because it is only in the sexual union that we can do the one thing that mimics the highest created order of God. What was the highest thing that God ever created? What was his best and biggest creation? Man, you and me. Why? Because we reflect his image. Well, how do we get more God image bearers? We get it through the sexual union. Sex is holy partially because it is the way God facilitates the creation of new beings that bear his image. Can anybody tell me that a newborn baby isn't just a wonderful thing to behold, that the act of childbirth isn't in itself a holy thing? It is through the sexual act that new life is brought into the world. Children are sanctified by coming in through this act of creation. Now, we mimic that creative act by bringing these new image bearers in the world, and that makes sexual union something holy and reverential. And here again, as Paul says, two that are joined to one flesh. This is the biggest problem in our culture today, is we don't value the creative act that produces children. We value children to a degree, although that's slipping. More and more I'm seeing people who want to have a child more as an accessory than, right? We don't because if you're a parent, you know that when you have a child, you better be selfless, because they will take everything that you have. We have our granddaughter with us for 3 or 4 days, and let me tell you, she's a handful, and she requires a lot of attention. But that's what you do. You put yourself aside because you need to serve her. They take a lot of attention, and you have to be selfless. Well, similarly, the sexual union should be approached as a way that's holy. Now, what does this mean? How does this change our message on sex? If sex is holy, how do we communicate that? Well, we need to go for the grandeur versus the gutter, as I said. If we treat the sexual union as unique, as holy, as reverential, instead of as common or just something that gives us pleasure, then areas of sex that don't fall into that holy realm start to become offensive much more naturally. In other words, it's one thing to say, don't do this because it's not right. It's another thing to say, don't do this because really it's offensive. Okay? So let me give you an example. The city council, maybe your mom says, no, you can't go to that. The fair comes into town, sets up, and your mom says, no, you can't go to that fair. Why not? Because I don't want you to. It's not safe for you. Blah blah blah. Most kids are going, oh, mom, what's the matter with you? What if mom says, no, I don't want you to go to that fair? Why not? Because they set up that fair over a cemetery. And that's simply not right. Your grandfather's buried in that cemetery, and you would be disrespecting him. You would take something that's holy, and they're using it for just common ground, for frivolity. Does that change your message at all? Does that have more impact for the child? See what I'm saying? Now, I know that this is anytime we take what is holy and make it common, it profanes it. So the high priest, for example, had certain priestly garments that he was required to wear. He didn't get to go shopping in those things. That would be an affront to people, right? That wouldn't make sense. We set those aside. We know that they're reserved for special occasions, but that doesn't make them bad. That makes them holy. If we use them every day, they lose their holiness. And what we need to do is we need to understand that sex is something self-giving, something that reflects the image of God and his created order. And because of that, it can be holy. Now, there's another example that I want to show you. And this is probably the most pornographic picture in the entire talk. Does anybody know what this is? It's art according to culture. This is Andres Serrano, did this in the 80s, where he took a crucifix and he submerged it in a jar of his own urine, photographed it, got a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts, and a lot of people raved about this image. Does that offend you? It should. Taking what's holy and treating it as common? It's terrible. Why don't we see the pornography that's on our computer screens the same way? Doesn't it do the same thing? Take the holiness of what God has constructed and throw it into the gutter. Do you see how breathtakingly horrendous that can be? And I got to get off this slide because I was really toying with whether to show that or not. But I wanted to make the impact. How do we say pornography is bad? How do we say those women's magazines on the counter are offensive? We should see them the way we see that image. Now, we're fallen people. And what the devil does is he twists our desires so that what we think we know and what we think we like, we forget about those. So sometimes we have to be kind of shocked back into our reality. That's why I think holiness in sexuality has a much bigger power than merely saying morality means do or don't. Okay? So the grandeur versus the gutter. Treating the unique, the holy, and the reverential as common or a tool simply for pleasure should be offensive to us.